Okay, so now turning to crime, that special kind of deviance that is punished by legitimate authority. This is a big topic in sociology, and it's part of deviance. It's part of the deviance topic, but it's really kind of its own thing also because of its special status in American society. I wanted to start by talking about some of the basic types of crime, the types of crimes that we have. We've already talked about white-collar crime, having to do with corporate executives, people with a lot of power and a lot of money who commit crime. The most commonly thought of kind of crime, when people think about what crime means to them, is often violent crime. This is crimes that are committed against another person bodily. So it would be things like murder, rape, forcible assault, etc., where someone is actually being harmed by this violent crime. And so this is kind of an extreme example in this picture, but you get the idea of what crime means, violent crime means. Another kind of crime, and a much more common kind of crime actually, is called property crime. And this is crime that's committed not against an individual bodily, but against their property. So anything like car theft or breaking into someone's home or purse snatching, or anytime you're actually stealing the property of another person, that's a property crime as opposed to a violent crime. There are also the so-called victimless crimes, where there doesn't seem to be anyone in a crime who is actually being hurt. Here's an example in the picture. I think you can probably tell this is a prostitution. A lot of people would call prostitution a victimless crime, since both parties in that crime are, they're willing for different reasons to engage in the activity. Another example of victimless crime is drug use, where the only victim, you can make the argument, is the person using the drugs themselves. Another example would be seatbelt use, wearing your seatbelt in a car. Who's hurt if you don't do that except you? Wearing a motorcycle helmet, another example, where only person that's going to be hurt when you're not wearing a helmet is if you get thrown off the bike and split your head open because you did so. It's not hurting society in general. But there are other people who say there are no such things as victimless crimes, that even in any of these instances there would be a victim. It's just not the people who are actually committing the crimes themselves. So the families of the people who are either being hurt or who are engaging in things like prostitution, who may catch diseases, etc. The prostitutes themselves, who are often abused by their pimps or by society itself, and who are forced into that position because of other social problems. The insurance companies who have to pay, and therefore the customers of insurance companies who have to pay when people don't wear their seatbelts and end up driving insurance rates up for everyone else. So there's plenty of arguments that there are victims in these crimes. They're just not as apparent. And then finally, organized crime. This is crime that is committed on a large scale and that is run pretty much like a business. So good examples are, here's a picture from the old TV show The Sopranos, where you have the traditional mafia, where they're doing illegal activities like engaging in prostitution and drug sales and gambling, illegal gambling, etc. And it's all very organized. It's run like a business. This is an example of a deviant career, by the way, where you actually go into this and it's not done on a small scale. It's done as an organization with its own bureaucracy. Street gangs are another example of organized crime. Street gangs, the One-Niners or the LA Kings or the Crips or the Bloods or any of the other street gangs that you've heard of, are engaging in organized crime activity. The very nature of the organization is that they're doing deviant things in the course of normal business. And so that's really organized crime as well. A lot of drug sales, organized murder, etc. Okay, so I wanted to show you some FBI crime data. This is just off the wire. It's from 2006, which I think, or 2005, which is the most recent I could get. But this shows the trend over the last few decades, at least, in violent crime and property crime rates. These are actual, here's the years we're going to look at, 1986, 1984, 2000, and 2005. And these are the number of people who are convicted of violent and property crimes. So the property crimes here will be in blue and the violent crimes in red. So let's look at this. In 1986, there were 11,722,700 people put into jail for committing property crimes. The numbers for violent crime, or pardon me, let's look at all the property crime data. Property crime went up slightly in 1994, up to 12,131,000. Then in 2000, it actually dropped. Property crime dropped right at the turn of the millennium, down to a substantially less figure than it had been 6 years before. And then in 2005, it actually dropped even a little bit further. So this is something a lot of people don't know. Crime has not been just steadily rising, as we would sometimes get the impression from watching the news or from listening to politicians. In fact, crime has become less common since 1994. Let's look at violent crime. Look at the tiny percentage that violent crime is compared to property crime. In 1986, 1.5 almost million violent crimes. In 1994, that number goes up substantially to 1.8 million violent crimes. In 2000, though, just as in property crime, it drops way off, back down to 1.4 million. And in 2005, it drops even further down into the just below 1.4 million category. So violent crime also becoming less common in the United States today, which is something you don't hear much about. But those are the actual statistics from the FBI. Okay, so this kind of begs the question, what groups are committing crime? Sociologists would be very interested in knowing if it matters what social group you belong to and if that makes you more likely to commit a crime. There are certain social groups that seem to matter. The first one you'd probably think of is age. And so let's look at some data on numbers of people who are convicted by age. This excludes juveniles. This excludes anyone below 18. Juvenile data is not published by the FBI unless you have a reason to ask for it, so I couldn't find data on that. But let's look at the rest of the groups. So the 18 to 29-year-old group is the largest slice of the pie. 37% of crime is committed by people in this group. But that's not to say that other people aren't committing crime as well. The 30 to 39-year-old group, 32% of crime. The 40 to 54 age group, 27% of crime. And even over 55, 5% of crime committed by those folks. So age does seem to play a part, but maybe not as big a part as some people would assume, with all the crime being committed by younger people. That's just not the case. Another thing which definitely does seem to matter is sex. The sex of the person in question seems to matter a lot, whether or not they're going to end up committing a crime. Here's the numbers. Number of males convicted of crime last year for violent crime, 1.3 million approximately. The number of females, that tiny little chunk, 98,600. A ratio of almost 12 to 1 males for females who actually get convicted of committing crime. So you're much more likely to end up in prison if you're male. Another thing that seems to matter is race. And this is a controversial one because people will argue why people of different races are being put into prison. And that's not something I'm going to get into in a lot of detail here. Your book gets into it a lot more, but it does seem to matter what race you are as to whether or not you're going to wind up in prison. Let's look at the rates per 100,000, number of people in jail per 100,000 for three races, white, Hispanic, and black. I'm going to qualify the word race and tell you that Hispanics are technically Caucasian and therefore the same race as white. But we're going to break it out just because these are the three groups, and well, it's the majority group in the United States, white, plus two of the most important minority groups, Hispanic folks and black people. And so let's look at the rates here. For white, 471 people are in prison per 100,000 for committing crimes. For Hispanics, that number is much higher, 1,244 per 100,000 in the Hispanic community are in jail for committing crimes. But the rates for African Americans and more generally for everyone who is black, regardless of ethnic heritage, are much higher. 3,145 per 100,000 people who are black are in prison. That's an extremely high rate compared to the other groups. And so for whatever reason, whether rates of crime are actually higher, whether enforcement is done more stringently in the black community, whether they're getting unfair representation going on between different races, whatever the reason, black people are put into jail at a rate of 3 to 1 more than Hispanic people and nearly 10 to 1 more than white people. And the last thing is social class, and a lot of people will argue that it is in fact social class that is getting people put into prison more than race, that race is simply a byproduct of social class because there are more people who are in minority groups living in poverty in the United States. And it does matter. The group that is most likely to begin put into prison are those members of the working and lower classes. The group that's least likely to be put into prison are members of the upper class. This is something that conflict theorists will point at and say, that's something we should be looking at as a society. Do you necessarily just become deviant when you're poor? That seems unlikely. So, social class is the last thing that seems to matter. I wanted to just show you some pictures to show what symbolic interactionists would say is important about crime, which is how we define these situations. And so here's a picture, and I think just from looking at this picture, you're going to make some assumptions. You're going to assume that the people on the left are police officers. You can see their badges and their guns. And you're probably going to assume that the people on the right have done something wrong. A lot of that has to do with just the dress and the postures of the people involved, and it has to be said, the clothing and the race of the people involved. We jump to conclusions a lot of times when we're defining situations. This actually is a staged situation. This is not real. This is from a TV show on HBO called The Wire. But I put it up there just to show that we do make assumptions just based on arbitrary evidence. We don't know what's going on here, but I think that you're probably in your mind forming opinions about what's going on. That's an important thing for understanding how deviance and crime are socially defined. Here's another picture. This time, I suspect that you're making a completely different set of conclusions based on the appearance of the people here, based on their facial expressions, that they're white, that they're younger. I think probably, does this look like a bunch of juvenile delinquents? I think you would probably say this looks more like a church outing or camp or something. Again, based totally on appearances and social situation. Has nothing to do with what's going on. This could be, the next big gang going down to rob the liquor store. You don't know. And then finally, once again, about jumping to conclusions, I will tell you there is a crime going on in this picture. This was taken in Durham, North Carolina, and there is a crime being done here. But a lot of people will jump to the wrong conclusion about what that crime might be. The crime that's going on here is the person on the right is an unlicensed clown. That's the only crime being committed in this photograph. The person on the right is an unlicensed clown, and in the state of North Carolina that is illegal. In fact, it is a serious misdemeanor because when the sex offenders laws were put into place, it was also put into place that you can't dress up as a clown unless you have a license. And obviously that was so that child molesters and people who were going to hurt children in some way could not dress up as a clown in order to entice children to come to them or whatever and accept things and then abuse them. So you have to be licensed in the state of North Carolina to dress up as a clown and to perform at children's birthday parties. So that's the crime being committed there. That may be not where your brain went when you first saw this picture. And that's something that conflict theorists and sociologists are very interested in, is how people form these ideas in their mind based not on reality necessarily, but on your perception of what reality is. Okay, and then last thing we'll talk about is the criminal justice system itself. And there are a lot of reasons that we have the criminal justice system. Here are the 4 that are usually given why we put people into prison. The first thing is retribution. We're angry as a society when people commit violent criminal acts against our society, and so we want revenge. Retribution means basically the same thing as revenge. And so one thing that we do is we try to make it very unpleasant for people in prison, and we try to make it, at least some prisons, and we try to make it something that people wouldn't want to do. So we get back at them by putting them into prison. And that's an important function of the criminal justice system for the victims of the crime. The next thing is deterrence. And what's meant by deterrence is if we put people into prison, we punish them, or we do the death penalty and put them to death, that people who are thinking about committing that crime will see what's happened to the people in prison and will say, I don't think I'll do it. I don't want that happening to me. And it deters them from actually committing that same crime. That's another purpose of the criminal justice system. A third one, and one you hear a lot about, is called rehabilitation. And rehabilitation is the idea that while in prison, we can teach people new skills, and so that when they've served their time in prison and they're let out of jail, they'll be able to be rehabilitated and to rejoin society with these new skills and become productive citizens. And so we have programs in jails with things like libraries where people can study. There are actually programs where you can take online classes and get your degree while you're in prison, etc., all with the idea that when they graduate from prison, they also graduate from school, and they enter society with a new skill that they can use to be productive citizens. Unfortunately, this particular purpose of the criminal justice system doesn't seem to work nearly as well as we would hope, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. The final purpose is called social protection, and this one has to do with simply taking criminals out of society, putting them out of commission. And so criminals are segregated from the rest of society so that they can't hurt people anymore. So if you're a murderer, one way to make sure that you don't murder anyone else in the general public is to put you away in prison. If you're going to hurt anyone else, it's just another prisoner. And that's something as a society we've decided is not as important as protecting the rest of society who are not prisoners. So social protection is another important function, just locking people up to get them out of society. And now I wanted to talk just about a few related issues. The first of these is called recidivism. And recidivism is how often people who are released from prison end up back in prison. And this gets to the idea of rehabilitation and whether people who are in prison are actually rehabilitated. If you're rehabilitated, you would expect that recidivism numbers would be very low, that people who get out of prison don't end up coming back. Unfortunately, that's just not true. Let me show you some data from the FBI. Just to read this to you, this is straight from the FBI statistics. Of the 272,111 persons released from prisons in 15 different states in 1994, an estimated 67.5%, that's over two-thirds, were rearrested for a felony or serious misdemeanor within 3 years. Almost half of those were reconvicted, and about a quarter resentenced to prison for a new crime. Those are staggeringly bad and depressing statistics for rehabilitation. If you've got 2 out of every 3, almost 3 out of every 4 people released from prison who are committing another serious crime within only 3 years, that is not a good argument that prison is rehabilitating anyone. This gets to the idea, too, of prison culture, and that's one of the reasons given for recidivism, is that if you want to learn how to be a criminal, what better place to do that than in prison? You can go into criminal as a not very experienced, or you can go into prison as a not very experienced criminal and come out with what amounts to a PhD in prison culture. So if I'm a small-time thief and I get put into prison, I'm not a very good small-time thief. What better place to find somebody who's better at being a thief than in prison? And so I actually learn from them. I make new contacts that I can use when I get to the outside to commit new crimes. And so I get enmeshed in this prison culture, and I'm retrained not to re-enter society legitimately, but to become a better criminal. And the more I go to prison, the better criminal I become, because I'm learning from the best. What better place to find criminals than in prison? Another related issue is the idea of probation. And probation and parole, which is the next thing we're going to talk about, are very closely related. They're both designed to make sure that the system doesn't get overcrowded, to keep prisons from being overcrowded, and to make sure that the criminal justice system doesn't become overwhelmed. Probation is basically being let out of prison early for good behavior. And usually you're eligible for probation after you've served a certain percentage of your sentence. And if you've been a good prisoner, you're often put on probation and you're let out of jail early. on the condition that if you violate the terms of your probation, which usually involve not leaving the state and usually getting some kind of meeting together with a parole officer. I'll go ahead and bring up the next term, parole, which is a very similar idea. Probation is that let me re-say this. Parole is letting be out of prison early. You're paroled from prison. Part of your sentence is going to be served on probation, which is once you're let out, the conditions that are put upon you. So you have to go meet with a probation officer, who is very often, by the way, a sociologist, who's been specially trained to help you re-enter society, to look for potential problems that you might be getting ready to do some sort of criminal act again. So the probation and parole systems work together. Parole is when you're let out of prison early, only serving part of your sentence. Probation are all those conditions that are attached to that in order not to be in prison, these are the things you need to do. Meet with a parole officer, hold down a job, not commit any crimes at all, and not leave the state very often. So the probation and parole systems go together, and they're both designed to let people out of prison early and to make sure that people aren't put into prison who don't need to be there, but who need some extra help reintegrating into society. And then finally, we have to talk about the death penalty. The death penalty, obviously capital punishment, not to be confused with corporal punishment, which is spanking people. Capital punishment is the death penalty. And the death penalty is a controversial issue, and it's one that I don't pretend to have the answer to. If we look at the four purposes of the criminal justice system that we just talked about, it seems that capital punishment, the death penalty, definitely does achieve two of those purposes. It serves as revenge, retribution, definitely, for society. What's the ultimate revenge more than killing someone? And it also obviously serves as social protection. Once someone's dead, they're obviously not going to be committing any crimes ever again. And so it definitely does serve those two purposes. The other two, though, are a bit more dicey and probably, at least according to the data I've seen, not true of capital punishment. Rehabilitation, obviously, if someone's dead, they're not going to re-enter society rehabilitated. So that one's obviously not true. And then finally, deterrence. This is the one that people really focus on. But all the data seems to suggest that capital punishment does not have a deterrent effect on people who are thinking about committing the sorts of crimes that would lead to capital punishment. The reason for this is, according to psychologists, people, in order to be deterred by the death penalty, have to make a rational decision that I don't want to commit this crime, murder or whatever it may be, that would get me the death penalty because I'm afraid of being killed myself for committing this crime if I go through the system. Well, because of the safeguards that we have on the system and because of the fact that people are very often thinking irrationally before committing a crime that would get them the death penalty in the first place, it doesn't seem like it has any sort of deterrent effect whatsoever. And there are people who would say, well, you know, we have too many appeals and we after 10 years of waiting, you know, that's not a real deterrent, and that's why it doesn't work. But the data doesn't seem to support that, actually. The data seems to support the idea that people aren't committing crimes reasonably when they're doing something like murder, and that they're not, whereas we tend to think about this reasonably and say, well, obviously I don't want to commit a crime if I'm going to be killed for it, that the sorts of crimes like murder that would get you the death penalty are not being committed rationally in most cases. And so it doesn't have a deterrent effect. And there's lots and lots of data to support that idea. Now, that doesn't settle the question of capital punishment. It obviously does serve two of the functions of the four. One thing, though, I want to show you, one last map. And this is a map of this is sort of the last argument that opponents of the death penalty bring out, is that it's an anachronism. It's something that civilized nations no longer do. And so if you look at this map, the states and countries in red, that deep red, are the ones that still have the death penalty. All of the other places, the ones in blue, it's been outlawed. And then the other two, the orange and yellow, it's been outlawed for the most part. It's only in exceptional circumstances. So if you look at the parts of the world where the death penalty is still in effect, the red parts, this is the United States. Most of the states here in the U.S. still have the death penalty, so it's mostly red. But look at the other countries of the world that still have the death penalty besides us. China, the Middle East, places like Iran and Iraq, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. So the Islamic world plus China and India and us. This is not the company we usually like to keep. These are not who we consider to be our peers in the world. Instead, our peers are all in blue. If you look, Canada, Mexico, Australia, all of Europe, all of the other civilized, what we would like to call first world countries of the West, have abolished the death penalty, but not us. This is the last argument that's given, that we're behind the times, that the people we're associating with are the repressive regimes of the world, the places like China and the Middle East, that we don't like their governments in general, and we don't like the way that the people in those countries are being governed and repressed, and yet that's the only other people who still have the death penalty. So the last argument is that as a civilized nation, it's time for us to move beyond that sort of thing. Now, you can buy that or not buy it. It's totally up to you.